We were on a training exercise in the army, and we set up camp for the night far from any town or road. The trees were dense around us, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant animal call. The day had been spent moving heavy packs and equipment, and by the time we set up our tents, I was exhausted. We ate quickly using our headlamps to see what we were doing, and then crawled into our sleeping bags. Only the feeble light from our flashlights and the faint glow from our bonfire could illuminate the pitch-black woodland where I was sleeping in my tent. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that was creeping in by staring up at the fabric above me. I thought it was just my tiredness, so I tried to sleep. When I woke up, I heard a strange noise, a low, steady thumping that sounded like something heavy hitting the ground repeatedly. I listened carefully to try to figure out what it was, but it was too heavy to be human footsteps. I sat up and quietly unzipped the tent, peeking out into the darkness. My gut told me to stay put, but something else, perhaps curiosity or a sense of duty, pushed me forward as I walked slowly toward the noise. The mist had thickened, making it difficult to see much beyond the faint glow of our dying fire. I couldn't see anyone else moving, so I assumed the others were still asleep, but the thumping kept getting louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, my boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. I moved the light around the camp, but I saw nothing unusual. As the cacophony intensified and the mist swirled around me, every stride seemed heavier. The limbs of the trees seemed to press in on me, reaching out in the dark like hands. I persisted, breathing clearly in the chilly air, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, as if something had been pulled through the dirt and leaves. My heart raced, but I resisted the urge to turn around and continued walking over the disturbed ground until I came to a small open space in the center of the clearing, where a massive tree with a twisted and gnarled trunk stood. I walked around the tree with my flashlight pointed straight ahead, trying to remain calm, but as I got around it, I froze. There was a huge hole in the ground, about 10 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with rough, freshly dug edges and pieces of earth scattered everywhere. At the bottom of the pit, something large and dark was moving slowly, and I squinted to make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared to be an animal, but it was too large and its movements were too deliberate, and I watched as it pulled something out of the ground, a long, thick root, possibly a branch, and repeatedly slammed it against the side of the pit, producing that terrible, continuous sound. Hit me hard. This wasn't an animal, it was a person, or what used to be a person, their body covered in mud, muscles straining as they dug desperately into the ground. The hole was filled with other things, 2 old bones, bits of cloth, and what looked like pieces of metal, or what it was, a grave or maybe several graves, all mashed together in one horrific pit. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This person had been digging for a long time alone out here in the woods, their mind gone from the isolation, or maybe something worse, and now they were creating this place, this pit of death. I turned and ran back to camp as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I reached the tents, I collapsed to my knees, trying to calm myself down. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just seen. We left the campsite at first light, no one saying a word about the night. I never told anyone about the pit, or the person digging it, but the memory of that sound, the steady thump of earth being moved, has stayed with me, haunting my thoughts now. Whenever I'm alone in the woods, I listen carefully, dreading the day I hear it again, because I know that if I do, it won't just be a sound in the distance, it will be close, too close, and I won't be able to turn away. The pit will be waiting, and this time I'll be the one pulled into the darkness. I had been looking forward to camping with a friend for weeks. We decided to hike to a secluded location, set up our tent by a peaceful lake, and spend a weekend away from everything. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, with only the sound of trees rustling and gravel crunching beneath our tires. We parked, got our gear, and started hiking. The trail was difficult to see because it was covered in dense brush and trees. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you knew exactly where it was. We navigated the forest using an old map I found online, and as we went deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler there, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. After a couple of hours, we reached the lake. It was small and almost hidden by the trees, with a surface as still as a mirror. We chose a spot on the far side away from any possible visitors. It was perfect. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and got ready for the night. The first night was normal with just the usual forest sounds around us. By the second day, we had explored the area and even found an old abandoned cabin a short walk from our camp. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with the roof falling in and the door barely hanging on. We peeked inside, but found nothing but dust and rotting wood. It was clear no one had been there for a long time. As night fell on the second day, the forest seemed to get quieter. We sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sense of being alone. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound: branches snapping, leaves rustling, and distant animal calls. But then we started hearing something different at first. It was faint, almost like wind, but it wasn't. It was a low, steady hum coming from deep in the woods. We both heard it, but neither of us said anything. It was probably just a natural sound we weren't used to, but the hum grew louder, and with it came a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like we were being watched, like something was out there just beyond the firelight. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was all in my head. But as the night wore on, the hum became more and more noticeable. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like a low mechanical buzz, and as it got closer, my heart began to race. I could tell my friend was also tense, but we both tried to remain calm because we knew we were far from civilization, with no self-service and no easy way out. Then, as abruptly as it began, the sound stopped, and the forest was silent, as if it was holding its breath. We saw it moving in the trees just outside the fire's glow, darting between the trees too quickly to see clearly. This made my stomach turn, and I wanted to say something to suggest we pack up and leave, but I couldn't find the right words. Darkness. The forest was quiet again, but the unease persisted, like the tension before a storm. We barely slept that night, and when morning finally arrived, we were both on edge, so we decided to shorten our trip and packed up quickly without discussing what had happened. I grabbed more wood, but my hands were shaking as I threw the logs on the fire. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to conceal something waiting to pounce. When we finally arrived at the car, I felt a wave of relief. We threw our belongings in the back and drove off, and as we drove away, I looked back at the forest, which was now only a dark line on the horizon. The hum and movement had stopped, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and even after all this time, I still can't explain what happened that night because there were no ghosts or monsters. I haven't been back to those woods because I've learned that some places hold secrets that are better left undiscovered, and that some experiences leave marks that never completely go away. I never expected a camping trip with my mother-in-law to become so unsettling. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The most unsettling part was just a sound and a feeling that something was out there that didn't want us there. I'm not sure if it was watching us or if it knew we were leaving. After dinner, we sat by the fire, and as darkness took over, the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch and twist in strange ways. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and went to bed early in the hopes that a good night's sleep would help. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound against the tent, my heart racing. I held my breath trying to listen, and the scratching stopped. In the hopes of finding some peace and quiet, my wife, her mother, and I chose a location distant from the hustle and bustle of the city, deep in the woods. I must have waited hours before I finally managed to peek outside the forest, which was perfectly peaceful and everything seemed normal, until I heard a faint dragging noise and lay there frozen, too afraid to move. I went back to sleep, but the apprehension persisted. The next morning, my mother-in-law seemed more exhausted than normal, with dark bags under her eyes and a nervous appearance. I remained silent, but I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something wasn't right. Later, we made the decision to go hiking. We followed a narrow path that took us farther into the forest. After an hour or so, I noticed new footprints in the dirt, but they weren't ours. They were tiny and appeared to be heading in the same direction as before, so I remained silent so as not to alarm anyone when we returned to the campsite. That night, the scratching sound returned louder and more persistent, and I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to make sure the forest was completely dark, with only my flashlight piercing the darkness. I discovered my wife and her mother huddled together, going through their belongings, some of which were missing personal items that weren't just misplaced but had been stolen. With my pulse racing, I scanned the campground and saw deep, odd marks in the ground that formed a circle around it. When I realized that they were too exact to be made by animals, my stomach dropped. I hurried back to the tent and tried to ignore the growing fear in my gut. I made up my mind, packed up our belongings, and told my wife that we were leaving immediately, despite her reluctance. We drove home in the middle of the night, feeling relieved as we left the forest behind. When we arrived home, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had escaped. The scratches, the missing items, and the eerie noises haunted me. I didn't find out until weeks later that the area where we camped had a history of strange occurrences and disappearances. The possibility that someone or something was watching us the whole time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack, is what terrifies me the most. I still wonder what would have occurred if we had spent an additional night. My grandmother enjoyed the outdoors and always claimed that it kept her feeling young. I was not as thrilled as she was, but I thought it would be wonderful to spend some time with her, so we went out to a remote location in the woods. I remember the camping trip with my grandmother as if it had occurred yesterday. Far away from any cities or people, Gran enjoyed the calm and tranquility. The first day was quite typical. We up our tent, had dinner over a fire, and watched the sun set behind the woods. Gran talked about the different plants and animals around us. Her voice was calm and steady, and it made me feel safe, like nothing could go wrong as long as she was there. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the sounds of the forest making me feel relaxed, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to just a few glowing bits of wood, and the night was completely dark. I could hear Gran breathing steadily from her side of the tent, so I knew she was still asleep. I tried to figure out what had woken me up. The night was still almost too quiet. I listened closely, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, which was starting to race. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar place making me nervous, and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard something moving outside the tent. It was faint, like a soft shuffling through the leaves. At first I thought it might be a deer or some other harmless animal, but then the sound got louder, closer, like whatever it was moving around our campsite. I lay there frozen, not sure what to do. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark, trying to see something that wasn't there. The noise stopped and I felt a small bit of relief, thinking it had moved on. But then I heard it again right outside the tent, just inches from where I was lying. The sound was different now, not like an animal, more like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, none of them good. I didn't want to wake Gran, thinking it might just be my imagination, but as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It only got worse. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached for the flashlight by my side, my hands shaking. I didn't want to turn it on, scared of what I might see, but I had to know what was out there. Just as I was about to turn on the light, the dragging sound stopped again, followed by an eerie silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something to happen. The silence dragged on, and I started to think that maybe whatever it was had left. Maybe it was all in my head, just me being paranoid about being in the woods at night. I slowly relaxed my grip on the flashlight, easing up. That's when I felt something brush against the side of the tent right where I was sitting. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, like a hand or a branch lightly touching the tent fabric. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode out of my chest. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm down. I needed to stay clear-headed, to think this through. I decided to wait it out, to see if whatever was out there would leave, but the minutes felt like hours, and the silence was only broken by the occasional rustling too close for comfort. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. No more dragging, no more rustling, just the sound of my own breathing and GR's soft snores. I must have fallen asleep when I woke up, because it was morning and sunlight was shining through the trees, and everything appeared so normal and serene that it was difficult to believe that the previous night had even occurred. I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for the noise to return, but it never did. Gran had already risen and was preparing breakfast by the fire. I didn't tell her what I had heard, and she didn't say anything either. Perhaps it was better that way. After breakfast, we packed up our camp, and I felt a strange sense of relief as we drove away from the woods. But as we left, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had been out there with us that night, something that didn't belong. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the trees. I can't explain what happened, but I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had turned on that flashlight. I'm never going back to those woods, but sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet and dark, I can almost hear that dragging sound outside getting closer. One weekend, I decided to go camping alone in the mountains, something I'd always wanted to do, just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet away from everything. I chose a spot far from other campers and set up my tent. The weather was fantastic, and the view of the trees stretching as far as I could see was exactly what I needed. I cooked some food and sat by the fire as night slowly settled and the woods got darker and quieter with every minute, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the rustling of leaves now and then. It was peaceful, just like I'd imagined, but something felt a bit off. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just a little nervous being out here alone. When the fire began to die down, I decided to go to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up to keep out the night. As I lay there, the quiet started to feel heavier. Every little noise outside seemed louder, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. But then I heard something different, heavy, slow steps on the leaves, like someone walking. They were slow, steady, and coming closer to my tent. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and everything went silent again. I could hear my heartbeat thing in my chest. I stayed still, too scared to move. After what seemed like an eternity, I listened intently as the footsteps began to move away again. This time, The tight feeling in my chest subsided a little, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or perhaps a large raccoon, even though I knew deep down that no animal walks like that. The following morning, I woke up shaken, but I tried not to let the night get to me. I looked around the campsite, looking for any signs of what might have been there, when I noticed something unsettling in the dirt near my tent. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to keep myself together, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each minute, even though I couldn't see anyone. I knew I had to go. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. As I hiked back to my car, every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the same quiet woods stretching out in every direction like they were hiding any sign of whoever or whatever had been there during the night. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was miles away from the campsite. I haven't been camping since that trip. I still don't know what really happened, but I know those footsteps were real. Someone was out there in the woods that night, standing right outside my tent watching me. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is the thought that's been haunted me ever since. What if they weren't just watching me? What if they were waiting for something, a moment when I wasn't paying attention to make their move? The more I think about it, the more I realize how lucky I was to get out of there when I did, but that luck might not hold if I ever go back, and that's something that keeps me awake at night, wondering if they're still out there waiting for someone else to come along. The air was cool when I got to the campsite, a remote spot deep in the woods. It had been years since I was last here with my ex-wife, and now it was just me. I set up the tent, started a fire, and tried to push away the awkward memories of her. Night fell quickly, and the forest grew dark. The fire crackled. The only light amid the deepening darkness was softly thrown. I was beginning to unwind when I heard a little rhythmic tapping, but I couldn't tell whether it was coming from a wayward branch or the wind. As the night wore on, I ignored it and concentrated on the warmth of the fire. The tapping became louder and more annoying, as if someone was tapping out a pattern or knocking. I checked outside the tent but found nothing, so I went back inside, but the sound persisted, now accompanied by an odd scraping noise. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to fall asleep because the noises kept getting louder and more aggressive, and the tent seemed to be shaking a little even though there was no wind. I finally unzipped the flap to check outside. The night was still and silent, and the fire was dying down. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything that might explain the noises. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I spotted something out, a shallow hole partly covered with leaves and dirt. I could see a corner of a wooden box sticking out. My heart raced as I dug up the box. It was old, and the wood was damp. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were personal items, photos, letters, and a diary. The stuff looked like it had been buried for a long time. There was also a map with a mark point pointing to a spot nearby. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I saw that the diary had entries about the campsite and the area around it. The last entry was from around the time of our last visit. It talked about someone watching from the woods and the need to leave before it was too late. Fear gripped me. I quickly packed up, deciding it was best to get out of there before anything else happened. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods were dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting for me to dig up the box. I never went back to that campsite, and I never told anyone about what I found. The sense of dread stayed with me, a constant reminder that some places hold dark secrets to this day. I wonder if the things watching from the woods are still there, waiting for the next person To uncover what should have stayed buried, I decided to go camping at a spot my neighbor had mentioned. It wasn't a place many people knew about, which made it seem like the perfect escape. A peaceful weekend away from the bustle of the city seemed ideal. I set up my tent and built a small fire after leaving early in the morning and traveling through winding, narrow roads lined with dense trees. As I got closer, the trees seemed to get taller and denser, making the road darker. The road eventually turned into a bumpy dirt path, and I soon arrived at the campsite, which was a small open area surrounded by woods with only a distant stream barely breaking the silence. As the sun went down, the temperature fell and the woods became even darker. The day went by peacefully, with just the sounds of birds and rustling leaves around me. I noticed something odd when the woods, which had been filled with animal sounds and rustling leaves, suddenly went quiet. It wasn't just any quiet, everything just stopped all at once. I felt a cold chill run through me, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The fire's light only illuminated a small area around me, leaving everything else in deep shadow. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to small sounds like something moving outside the tent. The noises were quiet, like something light stepping on leaves. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but with every noise the uneasy feeling grew stronger. In the early morning hours, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, and definitely human, moving around my campsite. They were trying to be quiet, as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart started racing as I lay there holding my breath, listening to the slow steps. I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping every few seconds. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would just leave, but they didn't. Instead, they stopped right next to my tent, so close that I could hear them breathing. I waited, not knowing what to do. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. Then, without warning, the footsteps started moving away. Slowly at first, then faster, until they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, too scared to move or make a sound. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to eat. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the campsite and made my way back to the car, feeling like something was watching me the entire time. When I finally arrived at my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my belongings in the back, got in, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, the feeling of being watched gradually fading as I increased my distance from that location. But when I got home, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone was still watching me. The woods had seemed so peaceful the day before, but now they felt like they were concealing something dangerous. Whatever it was, it followed me back and wasn't just in the trees. That night, as I lay in bed, I double-checked the locks on all of my doors, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Outside my window, I heard a soft creak that sounded like someone stepping on a loose board, and I froze, barely breathing, as the sound approached. It was the same slow, careful footsteps I had heard in the woods, but the woods weren't as empty as they seemed. Sometimes what follows you home doesn't just stay outside, it's already inside, waiting for the right moment to let you know you're never alone. And this time, there's nowhere to run. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brew fest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55, looking for an off-grid camping spot. We drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6. Miles before reaching the town, there wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no, she was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting more seriously each time. My girlfriend's sister and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually we told her we had to leave, and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m. my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly, pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and towards our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp and then heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, unzipping my tent slowly and silently, I cautiously poked my head out with my gun and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, I saw a full-grown buckhorn standing there, staring at the fire's embers as if it were trying to warm up. I was relieved, but I chose to frighten it away by hitting the tent's wall. I shouted, "Get out of here," half out of the doorway, and to my surprise, the deer just turned its head and looked at me before turning back to the fire. I tried again, louder and more animated, but this time it slowly turned and began to walk towards me, which was really unsettling because deer are normally afraid of people and don't approach them at this point. It was a big buck. I hastily returned to the tent, zipped it up, and waited until the buck approached. From the fur light on the tent wall, I could see its silhouette. It stood beside my tent entrance for a good minute or two before continuing to prowl around our campsite until it eventually wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different from a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I barely slept, but it was about 5 in the morning. I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek calling out, "Hello, can you hear me? Can I have some water? Water, I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired, and because it was so damn creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camped down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while, but there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold, a whole head of brownish gray hair like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. My only regret is not going more often, but I've stayed overnight in the Yosemite Valley area twice. The first time was at a housekeeping camp, where I knew the accommodations were close to others, so I assumed the other visitors enjoying themselves, clearly with a lot of alcohol, was okay. I don't drink, and I can't understand why anyone would come to such an amazing place just to get wasted, but everyone has their reasons. I find YNP to be an amazing and enchanting place, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be within driving distance of a place that people travel to see every year. With the exception of the individuals next to me who chose to drink all night and, as is frequently the case with AL's drinks, became louder and louder until 4 a.m., I was there for mine and others came for theirs, and I accepted that. They weren't obnoxious, but they were very loud, and I didn't get any quality sleep. My plans for the next day were ruined as I was exhausted and frustrated. Then this past weekend, I stayed in camp for again. I knew the campsites were practically on top of each other, but was still hoping for the best. The group of 3 who were set up about 10 feet from our tent seemed pretty low-key. They were playing music at a low volume and just chatting. I was worn out from a long day of hiking, crawled into the tent around 8:30 and quickly fell asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up to hear one of the people in the trio right next to me crying hysterically, clearly drunk, loud and sobbing like they just lost a loved one or a pet. This went on for over an hour. Finally calmed down, and I fell back asleep. At about 13, I woke up again to the same person literally wrenching and puking their guts out just outside their tent loudly, and they kept vomiting all night long into the next morning. It sounded like they had alcohol poisoning and probably should have packed up and gone home or to urgent care. It was that bad. I could hear their campmates trying to get this person to drink water or eat something, but they refused and just sat outside their tent puking and dry heaving. It was awful. Continue all night. I didn't get any decent rest. My plans for a full day of hiking were now ruined, but worse, I was angry. I was tired and feeling this unpleasant frustration bubbling up inside me. It was the opposite of how I wanted to feel when visiting this beautiful, magical place that brings me peace. I got up the next morning and saw that this person had vomited all over the campsite. As we were packing to leave as soon as possible, I put off eating anything that wasn't surprising and packed up everything. This person was still making terrible noises and sticking their head out of the tent when other campers from nearby sites approached and offered them food and coffee, but they turned them down. Is the valley always full of drunk idiots, or am I just unlucky? The bright side of all this is that I found a much better place than I would have imagined before. I thought that camping with my ex-husband might help us clear the air and possibly even bring some peace between us. We didn't split up in a big fight, but there was always this tension that never really went away. So spending a few days in the woods together seemed like a good way to end things on a positive note. I won't be staying in the valley again. I drove over to Tioga Pass and checked out the Tamarack campground, and it looks amazing, huge spots and secluded. The plan was straightforward: a small campfire, a quiet area by the lake, and nothing but nature surrounding us. The first day was peaceful. We set up the tent, collected some firewood, and sat by the water, watching the sun slowly set beneath the trees. It was almost too quiet, but as night fell, the air grew colder, and I felt a tight feeling in my stomach that wasn't just from the temperature. I couldn't figure out what was wrong that night because I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound seemed louder and sharper. I kept telling myself that it was just the forest and that nothing else existed, but no matter how many times I heard the rustling of leaves and the breaking of twigs, it still made me uneasy. I tried to reassure myself that something was wrong, but I couldn't get warm no matter what I did. The following morning, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air that was even thicker than before, and we didn't talk much, just went about our business as if nothing was wrong. However, the longer we stayed outside, the more I noticed small details, like the way he kept looking at me when he thought I wasn't looking, and the way he was quieter than usual, almost too quiet, as if he was waiting for something, and I couldn't tell. By the second night, the forest seemed darker, the sounds more menacing, the wind howling through the trees, and I felt like the darkness was closing in around us. I tried to ignore the growing fear by focusing on the warmth and light of the campfire, but it wasn't enough. Then I noticed things that made me feel really uneasy. His movements were odd and purposeful, and he kept pointing at the fire, but his eyes kept darting toward the tent and back to me. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. That night, I didn't sleep at all, so I lay there listening to the sounds outside and his breathing next to me. I felt trapped in darkness with no way out, and all I could think about was leaving him and whatever this was becoming. When morning finally arrived, I was tired, but I knew I had to leave. When I told him that I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to return early, he didn't argue, he just nodded, but the way he looked at me made my heart race. There was something dark in his eyes that I didn't want to face, so I kept my distance and made sure to stay close to the car as we drove back to town. The tension didn't even slightly lessen. In fact, it got worse. The road felt longer. The air inside the car felt heavier, and I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. When we finally returned, I packed up and left without saying anything, but the uneasiness lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong during that trip, something that wasn't just about us. A few days later, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small tear in my sleeping bag right where my back would have been. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been made with something sharp. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out clear as day. I tried to think back, tried to remember when it could have happened, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more things started to make sense. The way he had been acting, the looks he gave me, the silence. It wasn't just the woods that had me on edge, it was him. I had gone out there thinking it was just a simple camping trip, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't say for certain what had been on his mind, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe with him anymore. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong out there. We were alone, far from anyone who could help, and I kept wondering, what if that small tear in my sleeping bag had been meant for more than just a scare. What if it had been a warning, a reminder that no matter how things had ended between us, there was still a dark side to him that I hadn't fully seen before? That thought still keeps me up at night, because now I know there's a part of him I don't recognize, a part that I don't think I ever will, and I can't help but wonder if that part of him is waiting for the right moment to come back to finish what he might have started out. There in the woods, that's a fear I can't shake, no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over, because deep down I know it's not. I was always close to my sister-in-law Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together, so when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night away from any town. The drive up was pleasant. The trees grew thicker as we continued into the forest, and the campsite was lovely, right by a small clear lake. The first night was quiet. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too exhausted to stay awake. But the following day I began to notice things that didn't seem right. At first, it was small things. The forest's usual rustling of leaves and animal sounds had ceased, and the sounds of the forest seemed too quiet. Along the coast, I saw fresh footprints that weren't ours, that led out of the sea and vanished into the woods. I kept my thoughts about those footprints to myself, since I didn't want to frighten Sarah, but they were too large for a regular human. Later that night, as we sat by the fire once again, I heard a low, deep sound that sounded like a growl in the distance. I tried to convince myself that it was simply my imagination playing tricks on me, but it didn't make the bad feeling go away. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear, far out in the woods, but Sarah didn't appear to hear it, or, if she did, she didn't respond. When we eventually went to bed, however, the sense that something wasn't right just became worse, and I couldn't sleep at all. I jumped as I heard the sound outside. The wind. I lay in my tent, peering up into the darkness, listening for anything, and then I heard it growl again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Through the trees, the break of a limb, the rustle of leaves, everything sounded louder. With my heart pounding, I sat up and listened to the slow, cautious footsteps coming from just outside the tent. It sounded like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard, so I held my breath. The footsteps circled the tent and then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy, rough breathing that sounded like something large was only a few inches away, and I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too afraid to move. The breathing continued for what seemed like an eternity before abruptly stopping and the footsteps gradually moving away. Fading into the night, I was afraid to move until the sun rose, at which point I hurried out of the tent. The ground outside was uneven, with big tracks pressed into the soil that led back into the trees from the tent. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could without speaking to each other. When we drove home, the silence was heavy, and we both knew that something had been watching us. We never talked about what had happened that night, but we never went camping again because we were too afraid of what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what might have happened is enough to keep me from ever returning. However, the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake, whatever was out there, And now every time I see a quiet lake what may be waiting for its next opportunity to emerge just under the surface, I wonder. I've always enjoyed camping because it makes me feel free. This time, I'm planning to camp for a few days by myself, so I found a peaceful area close to a small lake in the middle of the woods. The only indication of other people is a tent set up a few hundred yards away. A man I had met before called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a little older, and he was dressed in faded camouflage. He mentioned that he was a retired commander in the military. The first day passed without any problems. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. First I didn't worry, people often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened, so I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite calling out, but there was only silence. When I saw a small patch of disturbed dirt near his tent, I thought it might have been the site of recent excavation, but it had been hastily covered up. My heart began to race, and I felt panic rising, but I forced myself to remain composed. I found a stick and dug, and as I removed the dirt, I discovered a shallow pit with a few objects, including a knife. A worn dog tag and a notebook caught my eye. The dog tag had a name I didn't recognize, but the notebook was what really caught my attention. As I turned through the pages, I discovered notes about survival skills, old military missions, and oddly, entries about this exact camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It explained that he had been following a man who fit my description and that he was planning to kill the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too similar to mine. Because of his anxiety and fixation on this mission, he thought I was an adversary. When I heard a twig break behind me, I swung around. But no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. I had frozen the forest because it was suddenly too quiet and too near. My thoughts were racing. He could have been in the military before, but something had obviously struck him, and he determined that I was the enemy. I didn't stay to see what he had intended to do, so I dropped the notebook and hurried back to my camp. With my hands trembling, I packed up my belongings as quickly as I could, hoping he would arrive at any minute. However, he never appeared, and the only noises were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and my pounding pulse. Even today, I can't get rid of the notion that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty driving him to finish a task that never existed. Even though I left the forest that night and drove nonstop until I was miles away, I can still see him waiting by the lake when I lie awake at night, and I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target or if he'll find me again. I know I should move on from it, but there's something about the way he looked at me that makes me think this isn't over. Perhaps it's just paranoia. Or perhaps it's the reality that he's still looking and that I'll never be completely safe. While my husband was away on a business trip, I made the decision to take my kids camping for the weekend. It was just the two of us, and we wanted to make some memories. We found a peaceful area at a small campground by a lake, which was only a few hours from home, so it seemed like the ideal location, safe, accessible, and yet far enough away to feel like an adventure. The first day went well. We set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and the kids had a great time splashing around in the lake. It was nice to be away from the routine, and when nightfall arrived, I put the kids in their sleeping bags and sat by the fire to enjoy the quiet. The stars were bright, the fire crackled softly, and everything was peaceful. I started to relax. The campground was small, and from what I could see, there weren't many other people there. There were a few tents scattered about, but it felt like we had the place to ourselves. At midnight, I made the decision to call it a night because the kids were asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. In the middle of the night, I woke up, got into the tent, zipped it up, and laid down next to them. At first, I was unsure of why, but then I heard a faint crunching sound that sounded like someone walking on gravel. I froze and listened carefully, and as the sound seemed to be approaching the tent, my heart began to race. I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and controlled, so I reached out to make sure the kids were still asleep so I wouldn't wake them up and frighten them. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and I could hear someone or something breathing slowly and heavily, almost as if they were trying to remain undetected. My mind raced because I had no way to see who or what was outside without making noise, and there was no easy escape. The person outside began moving again, dragging their feet and walking around the tent, and I could see a shadow shifting through the tent fabric as they moved. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise stopped, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting, but I heard nothing. I felt completely trapped, staying perfectly still and barely daring to breathe. The minutes felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep at some point because my body was sore and tense, but when I woke up, it was morning, the sun was just rising, and the kids were still sound asleep next to me. I quietly unzipped the tent and looked outside, but the ground was disturbed. It appeared as though someone had been walking in circles around our tent all night. We packed up quickly, but as soon as the kids were awake, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had been watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, and I still can't forget that night. The thing that scares me the most is the idea that whoever was out there might still be watching, waiting for the next opportunity to get closer. Since then, I haven't taken the kids camping. I have been looking forward to this camping trip with my son for weeks. We set up our tent by a small, quiet lake surrounded by dense woods, far from other campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just the two of us away from the noise and stress of everyday life. The first day went well, and we spent time cooking and fishing over the campfire. At nightfall, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. I felt content as I watched my son go to sleep in his sleeping bag at midnight. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, steady tapping, coming from outside the tent. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a branch moving in the wind, but the tapping became louder and seemed to come from different directions. Under the moonlight, the woodland seemed eerie as I silently unzipped the tent and ventured outdoors to attempt to locate the source of the sound. I thought it was just the wind, so I took a few steps away from the tent and saw nothing strange, just the dark shapes of the trees. However, the tapping continued all night and seemed to get closer each time. When I looked around the campsite the following morning, I saw no signs of animals or other people, just the same peaceful forest. We decided to go on a hike to try to get my mind off the strange noises, and when we returned to the campsite in the evening, everything seemed fine at first. I started preparing dinner while my son played by the water, and when I looked up, I noticed something strange on the tent. Tiny muddy handprints the size of a child's hand were smeared on the fabric. This made my spine tingle. I looked around the tent and couldn't find any footprints or other indications of anyone being there, so I tried to think it was a prank or possibly a stray animal. However, as night fell, the tapping resumed, this time louder and more urgent, as if someone was trying to get inside. I decided we would leave early the following morning, so I stayed up all night watching the tent and listening to the tapping. At dawn, I heard scurrying sounds near the tent, but I never saw anything. We packed up quickly and drove home, but once we got back, I couldn't get rid of the dread. Later, I learned that other campers in the area had also reported hearing similar noises, and even seeing strange figures in the woods. Looking back, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety that we had just barely avoided a far worse disaster, even though no one could explain what was occurring. The journey began as a straightforward father-son adventure came to an end with a terrifying reminder that the woods have more secrets than we realize. The muddy handprints and the odd tapping were never explained, but they left a lasting impression on my memory. Sometimes, I wonder what was waiting and watching in the dark just beyond the edge of our campsite.